Nothing on the Bonnell Foundations Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bonnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical. Here's your host, Laura Bonnell.
We're honored to have Dr. Ryan Thomas on this podcast. He is one of the Bonnell Foundation's Advisory Council members and a wealth of information. He is from Grosse Pointe. He's a Michigan State University graduate, went to Wayne State Medical School, and did his pediatric residency at Beaumont with a fellowship at Rainbow Babies in Cleveland. He is currently in charge of so many aspects of the CF clinic at Michigan State University. Just too long to mention, but we are glad that he is in charge of that clinic, and we wanted to talk to Dr. Thomas about what they're researching at the clinic and what they are finding with all that research and just their general knowledge and working relationship with their patients. Dr. Ryan Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. You are one of our wonderful advisory council members on the Bonnell Foundation. So it's great to have you and so wonderful to be able to feature some of the wonderful people who are helping us in education and raising awareness. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to talk to other members of sort of the CF community and hear a little bit more about what's going on.
Well, we definitely want to hear more about what you're doing and what plans you have for the future. But first, tell us what brought you to cystic fibrosis. Why did you end up, being a doctor at Michigan State University at the clinic there, and what enticed you into working in CF?
My road to caring with 4 people with CF was sort of a loopy one. My initial undergraduate degree is actually in astrophysics. And so I was not planning on being in medicine at all. And I got about 3/4 of the way through that and sort of decided, I don't think this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But I also didn't really want to start over. So I was sort of looking around and I heard about nuclear medicine and radiology and a lot of these cool things from some of my pre-med friends. And I was like, well, that sounds like a really good, interesting career that I could utilize some of my pre-existing training for. And so I switched and added a pre-med on and ended up getting into medical school. And then 2 years in, I'm doing my first pediatrics rotation. And I just had so much fun working with the kids. It was such a gratifying experience that I again sort of flip-flopped and switched and said, okay, I'm going to do pediatrics. And I have asthma. My whole family has asthma. And so I always found pulmonary physiology and pulmonary disease processes very interesting. And so that's sort of when I got introduced to cystic fibrosis, learning about that. And it's really something that once you go into pediatric pulmonary training, it's such a sort of a keystone of that training and that experience. And you get to see these kids and help them and it's such an important part of, it feels like family and patients' lives because we see them so often, we get to watch them grow up, that you can't help but sort of fall in love with taking care of people with CF and trying to work to make sure that they have better lives.
And what a unique community I think we're in, right? We're all so very close, from doctors to the nurses to the social workers, and you all kind of either know each other or in some way cross over either through a conference or like with my foundation, we have this beautiful group of all of you from all around the state of Michigan, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's a small world. The pediatric pulmonary world is a small world, and then the CF world within that is yet a little bit smaller. And I think it attracts sort of like-minded folks. And so it's always a pleasure to see people within this community and to work with them. It's just everyone's so giving of both their time and their energy and so dedicated to the cause. And it makes collaboration and working together just so easy and so fun. Because for other things, there can be rivalries. It can be like pulling teeth, trying to get somebody to give up some of their time. And it's just not like that with CF.
So how long have you been in the CF community now? How many years?
I'll be 5 years sort of taking care of CF outside of fellowship, and then within fellowship, there was a lot of that. So getting close to 10 years of caring for people with CF.
Wonderful. Why don't you tell us kind of the things that you're working on right now? I think it's microbiome. Is that kind of a project that you're working on? Can you tell us what that is and what you're doing?
So I got involved in this project of sort of working on the pulmonary microbiome really through Rob Quinn, who's a microbiology researcher up here at Michigan State who has a specific interest in cystic fibrosis. And so I became involved in this project largely helping to recruit through the CF Center and then sort of taking the data and helping put sort of a clinical spin. What is the clinical utility of this data? How could we utilize it sort of moving forward? And so, working with Rob has been tremendous, and it's enabled us to sort of produce this really interesting paper, which is really the first one looking at how the pulmonary microbiome changes in response to Trikafta.
So I guess explain a little bit more about, to help people understand what microbiome is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most people probably have heard of the microbiome, or at least are aware of its existence, so it may have been labeled something else, but that's largely having to do with the stomach and the GI tract. The GI tract especially has all these different bacteria and viruses and things that live within it. Some of them are good bacteria that are helpful, can help us absorb nutrients or help break down things that we don't break down easily, and some of them are harmful, but they're sort of kept at bay potentially by the other bacteria that are there. And then as many people who've been on an antibiotic or something like that know that if that gets perturbed, if that gets altered, if the balance gets sort of thrown out of whack, then you can have stomach problems and things along those lines. And so the pulmonary system, the lungs, mostly the airways we're talking about, also have a microbiome in it, though, as Rob likes to say, he said this when I was talking to him, and I've thought about it the same way ever since, is if the GI tract is a jungle, a rainforest of microbial life, the lungs are like a desert. There's just usually not much there, but there is something there. And it used to be thought that, the lungs and the airways are sterile unless there's something wrong. And we're really learning now that that's not the case, that there's a lot more down there and that there is a balance to it. And then certain disease processes like CF can sort of upset that balance. And we're over time trying to learn how is it different and what does this mean for people with CF.
And what does it mean? And what kind of microbiome are we talking about?
So in the CF airways, we all know there's bacteria down there. That's why we do these sort of cultures. And we know that there are sort of bad bacteria like MRSA or Pseudomonas or Burkholderia cepacia that can get down there and clearly seem to be associated with then poorer lung outcomes in the long run. But people were born with some of these bacteria in there. And in fact, we see in people with CF very early on, as early as infancy, these patterns of bacteria within the airways can change with time. And what's really interesting is everyone's microbiome is unique. And so oftentimes, even as things changes, your microbiome mimics what it normally is more so than anyone else, even if they have a similar condition to you. And these microbiome, it changes. So initially, there's a lot of different things down there. And then as CF progresses, we see it gets less and less diverse. We start to see, Pseudomonas taking over or one other bug or another taking over. And so if we can understand how that microbiome change is related to changes in clinical status, such as lung function, need for antibiotics, and things like that, it's going to help us better understand the progression of CF and hopefully unlock different treatment strategies in the long run that would be helpful.
And it's such a huge factor in our CF community. Just for example, between my two girls, who obviously grew up in the same household, the same bedroom, because they didn't like to sleep in their own bedrooms. They were always like sharing a room and sharing space and everything. And, not always listening when they were younger, drinking out of each other's same drink and et cetera, and all that worry about well, if one of you has MRSA or one of you has Pseudomonas, then you'll give it to each other. There's only so much you can do with siblings, right? Trying to control it. But I do also find it interesting that they don't have the same microbiome. They have some of the same, and then they have some different. And it's just really interesting, right? Because how does that happen in the same family? I mean, I know you could probably even argue that how can kids be so different even with a personality when you raised them, with the same parents? But I mean, that's part of what you're trying to learn, right? Like, how can one sibling have it and the other doesn't? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent example of things that we wish we understood better. How do two siblings with the same genes who grew up in the same place have sometimes wildly varying, clinical paths and outcomes? And some kids are more sick than others, and we have no understanding why. It's why, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation says, well, we can't make predictions about, outcomes and lifespans and stuff like that, just purely based on the mutations. Because we see two people all the time who have very, very similar mutations and otherwise similar lives who just things go very differently. Mm-hmm. We need to understand this better because things like antibiotics are a core of what we are using to treat CF. I mean, it's an incredibly important part of how we care for CF, but if you treat the bad stuff and you usually use an antibiotic, you think it will work, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Or sometimes you use an antibiotic that you later find out the bacteria were resistant to and they still work. And understanding the microbiome would help explain some of these things, which then potentially helps us maybe narrow the spectrum of antibiotics we use in the future, or, use different, more benign ones because we think they'll work anyways. I mean, it's really interesting all the ways that something that's really the cornerstone of CF therapy and the antibiotics, we still need to understand how exactly they're working within each individual person. And
also, then you have the challenge of, well, sometimes you do a throat culture and Pseudomonas is detected or it's not. Mm-hmm. So is it really there or is it just not detected? Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the answer to that? Is it you just keep doing what you're doing if it's kind of dormant? Is it dormant or is it not there? I mean,
yeah, that's always a hard thing to deal with clinically, because a lot of times the swabs, we know they're not perfect. They don't perfectly replicate what's in the airways. And there's different estimates to how good they are, but they can be as low as 60 or 70 or 80% sensitive, which means you really need to have multiple negative swabs before you could truly believe that something that was already there is now gone. And sort of vice versa, there may be things there that you miss originally, and then it delays treatment. And so knowing sort of the limitation of our testing is something that's important for us physicians, because we'd like to think that, everything's got like a yes or a no, and the test is 100% accurate 100% of the time. And we just know that not to be true with actually most of the tests we do in medicine. And so as we're giving recommendations to patients and families, some of the things we have to weigh in this are, well, how good is this test? A negative sputum sample is much more useful than a negative swab. But sputum samples are harder and harder to get these days because so many people are doing so much better that we just can't get sputum anymore without going through something cumbersome to the patient, like an induced sputum or bronchoscopy or something like that, which when you're doing quarterly screening is just not a reasonable thing to ask of someone. And so that is part of how CF is evolving even more now with the modulators, is some of the cornerstones of our monitoring we can't do. And I think that we see that in some of our research that's ongoing now, where we're trying to do these studies that rely on sputum specimens, and everyone's feeling so well they don't have it anymore. And that's a wonderful problem to have, but it does make learning about these things a little bit harder.
And it does kind of change, I guess, how you're doing the work. what do you do because of the triple combo drug that's out now that it's really changed that? How do you continue your research? And then how do you help the patient as far as detection goes of the microbiome?
Yeah, so from a research standpoint, it has required Rob, again, he's doing most of the work on this, to really rethink about how we can get specimens and how we can study these things. Initially we looked at, well, can we use swabs like we would do for the sort of routine clinical cultures in CF? And it just seems like that's not an adequate sample for the kind of testing you need to do for these sort of things. And so now he's looking at, along with the rest of his group, doing exhaled breath condensate, which is essentially you breathe out into a cold tube and it collects the moisture from your breath as well as whatever happens to be in it. And you can use that to look at different metabolites and other things in the lower airway. And so it's really forced some of our basic science researchers to get really creative, because one of the things we saw from our study is that as the microbiome changes, these metabolites, the different proteins and amino acids and sugars that the bacteria both eat and then produce, change. And that may be a key part of understanding why the microbiome changes, because if you're getting rid of some of the food for some of these bad pathogens, then there's going to be less of them. And so it may be just simple things like we're sort of starving the Pseudomonas away. But until we get more information, we don't know. And you can still study some of these metabolites and other things without getting a mucus sample the way we would have traditionally.
Is it exciting to see that thanks to this new modulator that you're not detecting some of these like Pseudomonas and other things as much?
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting. We have some data on these highly effective modulators that shows that a certain percentage of people who have chronic Pseudomonas will have it go away. Though that does seem, unfortunately, to be a minority of people. But having a chronic Pseudomonas infection is, clearly associated with more rapid lung function loss. And so even in a small percentage of people we can get rid of that in, I mean, that's a huge win. And then, for everyone else, sure, we can't survey the bugs as easily, but their weights are improving, their lung function's improving, they're feeling better, they're using less antibiotics, they're in the hospital less. And so it's just so exciting. All of that stuff, that little inconveniences just really don't seem to matter as much.
Do you find that the triple combination drug is taking care of just like MRSA and Pseudomonas, or is it at all impacting B. cepacia or MAC or any of those things that are so drug resistant?
I am not aware of any data about some of the other bugs. My sort of small clinical experience with this, because it's not, it hasn't been that long. When you think about some of the timescales for some of these other studies that can be done over the course of decades, the highly effective modulators have only been out there for a big percentage of people for a couple years now. It does seem to have an effect on some of these things, particularly in people who maybe haven't had them for that long. But it's hard because sometimes you're seeing less bacteria because maybe there really are less bacteria there, which should be a good thing. Or maybe it's because we're not getting as good a samples as we used to. And so we're seeing it less because of that. And so it's probably going to take a little bit more rigorous study to sort out really over the long run, are some of these early changes we seeing real, or is it just an artifact of not being able to get as much sputum as we used to?
And what are your thoughts on phage therapy? I mean, is this something that we really need to focus on a lot more so that we can deal with this other bacterium that can be so deadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is easy to say because I'm not the one doing it, but I think we should be exploring every potential treatment option we have. Phage therapy has been used in somewhat isolated situations very effectively in some pretty severe infections, including in CF. There is certainly a growing research interest about this. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll probably see some pretty exciting things because there are things like Cepacia, like non-tuberculous mycobacteria, certainly some chronic Pseudomonas, where it seems nearly impossible to get rid of using our traditional therapies, even when we do extremely long courses of antibiotics and extremely intense courses of antibiotics. And in a certain percentage of people, these infections clearly cause, rapid lung function loss. And so we need more tools for when the normal things don't work. And I think that's as a real opportunity for something that we could have for people who maybe don't have a lot of other options left.
So as far as the work that you and your group is doing, what do you see for the future? How are you going to keep moving forward? Like for the example that you said, like there isn't as much sputum in some of the patients who are on the triple combination drug. How do you move forward?
Well, I think some of it is going to lean on using different methods of collecting samples. So the exhaled breath, like we talked about already, but then also, potentially investigating other tools that we could use that a swab might be okay. I know they have some like PCR tests similarly to what, we use for COVID that was designed to detect Pseudomonas. And so if what you really need from a throat swab is there Pseudomonas there or not? Because if it is, we want to try and eradicate it. That may be sufficient if we can get that kind of sample that way instead of just doing the swab and culture. And we've gotten so good at all these other sort of research techniques to do bacterial sequencing and to do things other than just standard growing it on a plate and seeing what's there. I think there's a real opportunity to use some of these tools to answer questions when this traditional easy to obtain sample is no longer available to us.
Thank you. And now I wanted to talk about some other projects that you're working on. And one of them is someone that we know very well is Dylan Mortimer. He has cystic fibrosis. He's an artist. The best way to describe his work is glitter. And actually, you can see his, in this video podcast that we're doing.
Yeah, one behind you.
His artwork behind me. But he's a great guy. He's had 2 double lung transplants. He's just a fantastic human being and very inspiring. And tell us, kind of what MSU is trying to do with Dylan.
As far as I remember, because this is a couple years ago, again, it was Rob Quinn. And the Broad Museum at MSU is an art museum. And they would allow you to host little events or something like that. And Rob became aware of Dylan and his work and sort of shot an email or a request or something to the Broad Museum, seeing if they would let us do it. And they said yes, and we can do it soon if you'd like. And so then there was this sort of planning, and we have a collaboration, MSU and Spectrum Health out in Grand Rapids. And we have this sort of research, translational CF research group that meets every couple months, every month or so actually. And he brought it to and just said, hey, what do you think we can do with this? And so we had him scheduled to come to the Broad Museum in East Lansing to do a art show and fundraiser for CF research in mid-Michigan and Western Michigan. And it was scheduled for March 27th, 2020. And so, as you might imagine, that got canceled. It was a real shame because we were really looking forward to it. His work is so interesting, and it's an inspiration to hear everything he's been through and to see the art he creates and to see the way that his art kind of mirrors his experience, and so much of it is, CF related. And it just seemed like such a cool way to mesh, the art world and the medical world and to do something good for people with CF. And so I do believe they are working on trying to get something else together, but I don't know that we have any specifics to that yet.
Well, and he was just featured in the Spartan Alum magazine. So it kind of reinvigorated that plan to bring him finally, even though the pandemic isn't over, but at least now he can safely travel and come soon, hopefully.
Yeah. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to get to see him and some of his stuff in person. That would be amazing.
Yeah, that is wonderful. He's a great guy and very inspirational, and his work is fabulous. The pieces that I have of his are smaller, but he has some just enormous, gorgeous works of art that should be on huge walls in every hospital, as far as I'm concerned, because he's great.
Yes.
What else are you working on at the MSU CF clinic there?
As far as sort of the clinic, we're really, I'll say, it's been a hard couple years with COVID. It sort of upended everything. And, we're just trying to find ways to provide care to as many people as we can, as safely as we can. And it certainly put some stresses on us. And so, we're welcoming kind of getting back into what feels like a little bit more of a normal workflow and seeing our patients. And really kind of hopefully moving on from that, though, as you said, is certainly not over yet. And then a lot of the projects we have going on are really collaborations with, other centers or other parts of the institution. I'm working with sort of the newborn screening group through Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, as well as some of the other CF centers. We have a project we're working on is to hopefully get some grant funding to do sequencing for CF sequencing for newborn screens. We know that the genetic panels we have now are good, but they tend to under-identify people with CF from non-Caucasian backgrounds. And so how do we improve equity? Well, if we can expand our testing and make sure we're catching some of the mutations we see less frequently, we're going to make sure we're having more equitable screening processes for newborns with CF.
And can I ask you about that? How do you miss, because I know people of color are underdiagnosed. The Hispanic community, 3,000 in the United States, I think, is approximately, but I'm sure there's more, but why are they missed in newborn screening? Is it like what you just said, it's just that their mutation isn't listed?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand this. And I think there's some really smart researchers working with the CF Foundation who probably understand this better than I do and are actively working on it. But one of the major things is that these panels were put together so there's 2,000 different mutations that can cause CF. It seems to grow every day. But our panel only has 60 mutations on it. And the 60 that were selected are the ones that tend to be most common within the community, at the time that decision was made. And so, I think people from sort of different genetic backgrounds may be more likely to have rare mutations. And then there was a bias for a long time that cystic fibrosis only happened in people from European ancestry.
Right.
And so you would oftentimes see the diagnosis was late and people didn't consider it or thought it was impossible. And so when you build that sort of systemic history of under-identifying people with CF from, Black and brown people with CF, then all the decisions you make about, what genes are most common and which one should be the panel and stuff like that, have the potential to be biased. And nobody taking care of CF would do that intentionally, but it's something that we increasingly have to recognize in medicine, is that we have not always been equitable and we have to work together to try and fix it.
And how can we fix it if cystic fibrosis is already on newborn screening in Michigan and many other states? Can't we demand that I don't know how complicated it is. How complicated is it? Can't you say, we need to put all 2,000 mutations on this panel? How realistic is that?
I think that's where the idea that maybe we should, instead of be using these panels that are limited in their scope, just be jumping to do sequencing, which is going to get almost all the mutations. I'm not a geneticist, so I'm sure there's some exceptions there, but you're going to get much closer to identifying everyone if you expand the number of mutations that are tested for. Because the way it works currently is we measure the blood spot from a newborn for IRT. That IRT, it can be elevated in people with CF. In fact, it frequently is, so not always. And if the IRT level is elevated, then the mutation panel is done. And so there will be some people who have an elevated IRT and a negative panel who then no further action is taken, because at least the data the state collected originally is there's like a 1 in 10,000 chance that child has CF. And a letter sent to the pediatrician, which probably gets put in a folder somewhere and nobody really thinks about again. And so an easy place to start is, well, if we sequence everyone, then we're going to make sure we're catching every mutation that gets flagged with a positive IRT, and then we can go from there. And then the other thing is just awareness within pediatricians and family doctors and people who are on the front lines doing primary care. The screening positivity rate, both because IRT doesn't catch everyone and then the panel doesn't catch everyone, it's been estimated anywhere from 85 to 95% sensitive, which means that anywhere from 1 in 20 to 1 in 10 people being born with CF may have a normal newborn screen. And the screening is to try to identify as many people as possible, but people still need to have an awareness that there is undiagnosed CF out there. And if we're not paying attention, we'll miss it, and that leads to delayed diagnoses and potentially worse outcomes.
Wow. And it's the same with African Americans and Asians. I know with African Americans, I think it's 5% of the CF population, but of course it's got to be so much higher. It's just that they're underdiagnosed. And then, as you know, with Dr. Nasser, who has been fighting to get testing in Egypt, her, native country, she diagnosed 1,000 people when the Minister of Health finally allowed them to test, and she's expecting that there are thousands more that are undiagnosed. Right. It's just, we have a lot of work to do, right? We still have a lot of work to do to make sure that everyone gets properly diagnosed. Thanks for kind of explaining kind of where we are with that newborn screening. And in addition to seeing your patients, are there other things you're also working on or things that you're hoping to look into in the future as cystic fibrosis so much is changing quickly?
Yeah, a lot of the things we're working at within our center are really quality improvement measures to ensure that we're optimizing the care that we're providing. And CF teams are big. They have a lot of different members. And that allows us to give this sort of multidisciplinary care all in one visit to do a lot of things for patients all at one time. But when you have these big teams within big health systems, it's easy sometimes to not have everyone on the same page. And so really what we've been doing is trying to streamline some of our processes to make sure everyone's getting on the right treatment at the right time, and that we have sort of a uniform approach to, one, so the patients know what to expect, but then two, so do the other members of the team. If we get a positive Pseudomonas culture, we have sort of a set number of steps that we do to, try to get rid of it using the best data we have available to us, and then reassess, is it really gone, and make some of those decisions. And it's something the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has really put an emphasis on in the past 5 to 10 years is how do we optimize the quality of the care that we're providing? And sometimes it's just, they say that medicine should be more like a pit crew than sort of the lone cowboy just doing it on their own. Is everyone on the team has a role, and, we have to put them in positions for success, and then make sure we're collaborating and communicating appropriately to get the best outcome for the people we're taking care of. And so, that's really been my approach since stepping into the CF Center leadership, at Michigan State is, how do we take the things we're doing them and make them, just make it repetition and make it the right thing every time, and not making it so we have to sort of rehash the whole process of what we're doing every time.
Well, thank you for sharing, what you're doing at the Michigan State University Clinic. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, a couple of the things that we touched on today, if people are more interested in this, and this is probably more directed at people with a medical background, though people living with CF or taking care of someone with CF certainly have a pretty medical background. They might know more about this stuff than even they think they do. But I work with the American Thoracic Society doing podcasts. They're called Breathe Easy. And I did one on the cystic fibrosis pulmonary microbiome, which overlaps a lot. And it's a really good primer if you're more interested in what we were talking about today. I did that with Rob Quinn and Lindsay Caverly. And they really are, and she's from U of M, and they really are true experts in the field. I have an interest in this because I'm a clinician, and so understanding this helps me learn about how to better take care of my patients. But I don't claim to be, a basic science researcher doing this stuff. And so they have a lot of things in there. And then I did do a podcast, and this is a couple years old and it's changing so fast, but about bacteriophages and cystic fibrosis, and a little bit about what bacteriophages are and sort of their potential role in CF. And as we're seeing, that's just growing and growing. So some of it's probably out of date, but I think it would be a nice thing for people who are more interested in learning more about this. All
right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everything you're doing and all the knowledge and work and how everything's progressing to help the CF community. So thanks for coming on this podcast and sharing all your knowledge.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate having me on to talk about some of these things, and it's just such a pleasure to be part of the CF community, and it's an exciting time to take care of people with CF, and I'm just happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, check them out online at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, the science of possibility, and produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts.